Good morning, everybody. It's a cold and dark Friday morning, but great to be alive. And thank you, as always, for joining us for our Bible reading for today. By the way, if you happen to be in the Penn District on Sunday night at about 5:30, we're going to be singing carols on the green. Please do dress up warm, wrap up, bring your mulled wine, bring your mince pies, whatever you normally bring. Wrap up warm. It's very, very popular. Do come along Sunday night at 5:30. We'll be singing carols on the green. We'll be singing praising God for the birth of Jesus on Sunday evening, 5:30. We'd love to see you. But today we're carrying on our adventure through the Psalms, and it's another Psalm of David, and it's Psalm 28. So here goes. To you, O Lord, I call, my rock. Do not refuse to hear me, for if you are silent to me, I shall be like those who go down to the pit. Hear the voice of my supplication as I cry to you for help, as I lift up my hands towards your holy sanctuary. Do not drag me away with the wicked, with those who are workers of evil, who speak peace with their neighbours, while mischief is in their hearts. Repay them according to their work, according to the evil of their deeds. Repay them according to the work of their hands. Render them their due reward. Because they do not regard the works of the Lord, or the work of his hands, he will break them down and build them up no more. Blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the voice of my pleadings. The Lord is my strength and my shield. In him my heart trusts. So I am helped, and my heart exults, and with my song I give thanks to him. The Lord is the strength of his people. He is the saving refuge of his anointed. O save your people and bless your heritage. Be their shepherd and carry them forever. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, we have here, it's a psalm by David, and it carries on a very similar theme to what we have had in quite a few of these psalms recently. You have 9 verses in Psalm 28, and in verses 1 to 5, you have the sounds of somebody who's in trouble, and then something happens, and he obviously gets confidence that his prayer has either been heard or God's already done something about it. And verses 6 to 9, he praises God. So verses 1 to 5, he's laying out his trouble before God. And verses 6 to 9, he's praising God for having answered his prayer. A very similar theme to what you get in a lot of David's psalms. David seems to have had a lot of enemies, a lot of trouble, but he seems to be very good at pushing into God. And it's another psalm on that theme. So what about this one? Well, I think you've got a guy in trouble with his prayer, and then the second bit, you've got him praising God for having answered it. But I think what's interesting here is not only is it trouble, you've got big trouble and urgent trouble here too. Notice this here, if you are silent to me, I should be like those who go down to the pit. So in other words, he's not just in trouble, he's in big trouble. And it's a very, very strong sense of urgency here. So he's not just in trouble, he's in serious trouble here. This is potentially life-threatening trouble he's in here. So here, not just trouble followed by praise, but actually big, urgent, life and death trouble. That's kind of thing what's going on here. So feel the kind of sense of urgency in the prayer towards God. Okay, so it's not just trouble followed by praise, it's big trouble followed by big praise. It's important to hear that too. Okay. Then there's a couple of terms I want you to know about. Firstly is the word rock. He says here, for you, my rock, do not refuse to hear me. Rock is well, by definition, it's a hard, solid place. And by calling God my rock, he says, he's claiming that amidst of all the changes of life, God's the one thing he can hold on to. We all need something in life, especially when life is difficult, when everything seems to be changing, something you can hang on to. And David here calls God, he says, my rock, do not refuse to hear me. In other words, whenever there's trouble, that's the kind of, God is the rock which David holds on to. So hear that kind of message of, how's the old prayer put it? In the midst of the changes and chances of this world, help us to repose on your eternal changelessness. Okay, so for David, God is his rock. The other word I want you to just notice is the word pit, which is also in verse 1 too. Now, pit can mean a couple of things. It can mean death. It can refer to a place called Sheol, which is where they reckon people went in the Old Testament after they died, a kind of shadowy, deathly type, sort of tomby type place. Not to be confused with hell, but it was a kind of shadowy place, a deathly type place where you couldn't praise God anymore, basically, is what it was. And he's saying here, he talks about, I don't want to be like those that go down to the pit. So it can mean death. It can also mean the pits in life as well. I mean, it can mean, it can mean a pit where they used to put prisoners. More on that when we get to Psalm 88. But actually, it can be like the pits in life. It's just a nasty place. So either way, the pit can mean life and death. It can mean death. It can also mean, as I say, the pits in life as well. Either way, it's not a very nice place to be. So hear the word rock, where David depends, which is God, and hear the place pit. Just get the sense of urgency in the trouble here. But like I said, the psalm's in two parts. There's 1 to 5 when he's laying out his trouble, and there's verses 6 to 9 when he's praising God and extolling the virtues of God at the end. But I think one thing to notice here, which is quite interesting, is that when he's laying out his trouble in verses 1 to 5, notice he's talking to God. And in verses 6 to 9 at the end, he's talking about God. I think that's quite interesting. And it's not the only time it happens. In Psalm 23, the Lord, he talks about the Lord as my shepherd. He's talking about the good. Then when he gets to the shadow, he said, you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. So notice here, and I think it's quite interesting, that in Psalm 28, again, in verses 1 to 5, when David is in real trouble, okay, notice then he talks to God. And verses 6 to 9, he talks about God. And I think it's interesting, I think it's important we recognise that prayer is really something that should be a vertical thing. I think actually in lots of ways I don't know, I do really. I don't talk enough to God. I talk a lot about God. It's kind of what I do, isn't it, really? But, it's where I wear the collar for, isn't it? Telling people about God. But I think actually prayer is about talking to God. It's about engaging with God. And the first 5 verses of this song are really about engaging with God. But notice in the end, he stops talking about to God and starts talking about God. So in a sense, I suppose he's in a different situation. He's praising God and telling everyone the great things God has done. So I just think it's important to kind of notice that in the first half, when David's in real trouble, that he talks to God. And at the end, when things are okay with him, when things are being turned around, notice then he talks about God. And I think it's quite interesting to do that. And I think also, as I said a couple of Psalms ago, really, that David had a lot of troubles in his life. As I say, he had a lot of enemies. And usually when he handled the enemies, he was actually very close to God. The enemies, if you like, kept him on his toes. One of the very few times when he really fouled up, when he decided to have it away with one of his commander's wives, they called Bathsheba, was actually when he was chilling out. So when things were difficult and stressful for him, his prayer life, his life with God, his faith, if you like, was very strong. It was when things got all right for him, when he was chilling out, when he was relaxing, when everything's fine in the garden, that's when things were difficult for him. And notice here that in verses 1 to 5, when he's in trouble, he talks to God. And it's afterwards, when things have gone right for him, he talks about God. And I just think it's important to keep recognising in our prayers to make sure that we keep talking to God too. But I think there's something else interesting, just one final thing really. What makes the big mood swing? In verses 1 to 5, he's tries to say he's getting trouble. And then verses 6 to 9, he's obviously utterly confident that God has heard his prayer and everything's going to be fine. So the question is, what has changed? Could there have been a time gap between the first bit and the second bit? Could it have been that somebody has preached a sermon or something between one and the other? Or has he just sort of turned to God and decided, yes, God's with me and everything's fine after all? But either way, whatever's happened, I think what is interesting is at the end, he talks about the Lord is the strength of his people. He's the strength of his anointed. Save your people and bless your heritage. We tend to think when we try and remind ourselves of great things God has done, we tend to try and think of great things God's done in our lives. So I remind myself of times when God's helped me from this and God's strengthened me in that and God's guiding me in this and all that's good. But he talks about people here. And actually, I think it's important that we remind people really of the great things God has done to his people, not just to individuals, but to his people. Which is why it's interesting. I did a school carol service last night, a nativity, and as you can imagine, they're great, aren't they? Great fun, and you've got lots of people in church. And then I told them the story of the birth of Jesus using chocolate bars, and because they loved it. The kids want the chocolates without realizing they're all about 20 years old because I've been using the same talk for many, many years. And I keep wondering, why did I do this? But I think really it's about keeping the story going. It's about telling the people at the carol service that God loved us so much that he gave his only son. That God is the strength of his people. And I tell them the story so that we can potentially, when their times of trouble, or when our times of trouble, we can be reminded that God is like that. That that's what God is like. God's not just the strength of me, God's the strength of his people. And it's God's work with his people can strengthen me, and God's work with his people can strengthen other people, and also can help people, so if that makes sense as well. So we shouldn't just remember the times that God's done great things for me. I should also remember the times when God's done great things for his people. Not sure I put that well, but I hope that kind of makes sense. So, two halves to this psalm. David is in trouble. He prays to God, and he's in big, urgent trouble. Then at the end, he praises God because he's confident that God's heard him. He's in big trouble, okay? And then he's in big rejoicing. When he's in trouble, he tends to talk more to God. His faith is really strong. He's engaging with God. When things are better for him, he tends to talk more about God, which is quite interesting. Notice that he calls God his rock, which is something he can hang on to when times get difficult, with something changes. And finally, also, let's be encouraged not just by the great things God has done for me or for us as individuals. Let's remind ourselves what God has done for his people. And let's, especially at times like Christmas, let's remind everybody, let's remind the community just how great God is. Have a lovely weekend, my friends. I hope that makes sense. More lovely songs.